Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Denket, doch, Menschenkinder, which translates to just think, you children of men. All in all, pretty interesting chorale. Harmony's not necessarily the most straightforward in this one. There's definitely some room for interpretation regarding, where the scale material is coming from in some of these sections, because we get some like Mixolydian influence, especially in the beginning and at the beginning of the second system as well. But chordally, relatively straightforward. As far as notes are concerned for this particular chorale, this chorale was just part of the Deedle collection and the Penzel collection as well, and it was assigned a BWV number in 1998. So definitely later in terms of the chronology of collecting all of all of Bach's works under the BWV cataloging system. But we're just going to hop right into the analysis. There's a lot to talk about in this one. So we have one flat in the key signature. We start on F major and we end on F major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is F major. Passing tone in the melody here. And then we get C, C, E, and C. It's a 5-chord C major with a passing 7th on the tenor. And then we get D, A, D, and F, which is our 6-chord D minor. Passing tones in the upper voices don't really give us a chord that we can analyze here. And then we get C, D, F, and A, which is D minor, sorry, that's a B flat. D, F, F, oh yeah, no, apologies, sorry, I'm getting confused here. C, D, F, and A, which is in fact taking our D minor chord, adding the 7th, and putting it in third inversion, D minor 7 over C. So bare minimum, we would expect this to resolve to something with a B flat in the bass, but typically the roots are going to be a 5th apart going downwards, meaning that usually a 6-4-2 chord would resolve to a 2-6 chord, but in this case we actually don't get that resolution. We get B flat, D, F, and B flat, which is our 4 chord, so a bit of an irregular 4-2 resolution, not the most irregular of 4-2 resolutions, but still makes sense, right? There's logic going on here. But we are looking for movement to the key of B flat major, because we do get E flats throughout the next measure, and we cadence on a B flat major chord. It kind of sneaks up on us because the melody feels pretty undeniably F major like up until this point. So we get A, C, F, and C, which is F major over A, and that's a tonic triad and first inversion, but with E flat sharing the same beat. I reckon this is actually where we're going to B flat as well, and F major is now functioning as our 5 chord. We then get B flat, F, and D, which is our new tonic, B flat major. Anticipation here in the melody, and then we get F, A, F, and C. E flat is our chordal 7th, but it's a non-chord tone on the harmonic rhythm. So this is just a 5-chord F major, and then we cadence on B flat major. B flat, D, F, and B flat, tonic triad in root position. Moving to the next phrase, we have a similar profile to the previous phrase where I believe we start in the key of F major. B flat is also our 4 chord in the key of F, but we end up moving our way back to the key of F by the end of this phrase. But we get B flat in the middle. It's definitely a curious phrase because of this E flat here and this E natural that's happening in the not too distant future. So we do get a half cadence in the key of F, but this E flat here is very curious. I wonder exactly what Bach was thinking in terms of like pitch material here. Are we in F Mixolydian and this E flat is the flatted 7th and we're just cadencing on the 5 with the natural 7th? Or are we briefly visiting the key of B flat major and then we're pivoting to the key of F at the end? I think the latter, just because I'm giving Bach, or I'm looking at Bach through more of a tonal lens than a modal lens, but it's definitely not something you can neglect. It's here in the texture. So we have B flat taking us to C, C, E, and G, which is our 5 chord. C is our root, so we don't need to mark it. We then get B flat, C, G, and E natural. I think this F here is a kind of like a 4/3. Oh, sorry, like a it's like a almost like a false suspension, but it's an accented non-chord tone, kind of like a sus chord going on here, where E is actually the third of the chord. So really, this is just our 5 chord turning into third inversion, and we would expect this 5 chord to resolve to 1 in in first inversion, which is what we get: A, C, F, and F. So here we see a 4/2 chord resolving the way we would expect. Then we get F, A, F, and C, which is just our tonic triad in root position. This B flat is a 4/3 suspension, and this 4/3 suspension or accented non-chord tone here that happens to sort of operate like a 4/3 suspension kind of gives me an inkling that this is also our 5 chord in the key of B flat, namely because of the fact that not only do we get the 4/3 suspension, but we also get E flat on the next beat, which I think is either a very helpful coincidence, or it's just a clear indicator that we're in the key of B flat just for a couple of beats. But we get B flat, F, and D. This E flat is another sort of accented, suspended fourth. Like this is a sus chord, and this is just our tonic in root position. We then get G, D, F, and another sort of sus chord going on here, a 4/3 suspension, but B flat here being the third of our chord, that would be 6, 7 in the key of B flat. But as I said at the beginning of the phrase, this was just a brief visitation of B flat major. So I think G minor 7 is also operating as R2 in the key of F, and then that serves as our predominant to C major. C, C, E, and G, our 5 chord. Okay, next phrase, we get an imperfect authentic cadence at the end of it in the key of G minor, but we get to G minor through D minor. So I think Bach is exploring the same key centers just from the minor side of the key rather than from the major side of the key, but we're still preserving that same relationship between 1 flat and 2 flats, the E natural versus the E flat in the scale. So starting things off, we get F major, F, C, F, and A, which is our tonic in the key of F, and our resolution to our half cadence, which doesn't always happen, but sometimes does. I think this is also operating as our 3 chord in the key of D minor, because we get, not only do we get E natural on the next beat, actually the E natural really wouldn't be a huge indicator. In fact, that might even be a bigger proponent for the fact that we're in the key of F major if we were just looking at the melody, but we get C sharp in the alto. That's a better indicator that we're moving towards D minor if we were moving towards any key. We have 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm here. We get G, B flat, E, and B flat, which is E diminished over G, 2, 6. Then we get our 5 chord with this sus going on here, the 4/3 suspension over the bass, A, C sharp, and E. It's our 5 chord. And then we get D minor, D, A, D, and F, tonic triad, root position. We also get some passing tones in the upper voices before we get D, D, F, and A. No need to reanalyze. Passing tone here in the melody. And this is a modulation zone. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you know that I've talked about modulation zones in the past, which refers to a period in which there's multiple instances in which you could analyze a modulation because it's unclear that the modulation has happened just yet. We have chromaticism here in the alto, and you could call this D minor chord a minor dominant in the key of G minor if you wanted to, but for me, I think this is a case where the modulation is happening after the tonicization. and what that means is that we have A, C, F sharp, and C, and where this is the leading tone chord of G minor, I think we are still in the key of D minor here until we see the G minor on the next beat. So D and E flat are non-chord tones, and then we get B flat, D, G, and D, which is just our 4-chord in first inversion, G minor over B flat, which is also our tonic in first inversion, G minor. We then get F sharp, E flat, A, the C is in anticipation, and C, which is 7/7. Or if you look at this D as the root of the chord, this could be 5/6/5. Really, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, because the chords both contain mostly the same pitch material and they function the same way, which is often the case between chords that have similar pitch material or chords that are a third apart as far as their roots are concerned. And then we get G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our tonic triad in root position. Okay, so moving on to the next phrase, we actually get a distant modulation, which is really interesting because although they're not entirely foreign to Bach, we do see distant modulations occasionally. We haven't seen one in a really long time, so I'm excited to be analyzing one. We get a perfect authentic cadence in the key of the dominant, C major. So really in the grand scheme of things, we have just a big 2-5-1 progression here, G minor, C, and then presumably F at some point here. But yeah, we're moving to the key of C major from G minor. That's 2 flats to no accidentals, which is not a adjacent key on the circle of fifths, which is the relationship that typically maintains, or it's typically maintained between modulations in Bach's chorale writing. So we start off, I think, with a direct modulation because we have a case of G minor turning into G major, and even though that's not inherently a clue, if we were just looking at the key of G minor moving to another key, this could be 5 of 4, for instance. I think because it's a new phrase and we're juxtaposing G minor and G major with the chromaticism here in the melody, I'm going to hedge my bets and say this is a direct modulation. It doesn't make too much of a difference if you choose to analyze it as a common chord modulation. It's really just your interpretation of the material. What's important is that you know there's a modulation that's happening at this point. So we get G7 over F, F, D, G, and B natural, which is 5/4/2, and we would typically expect a tonic triad after this. Coincidentally, as a passing chord, we get F, D, A, and C, so I will mark this as a 2-6-5, no, sorry, a 2-6-5 chord actually, D minor 7 over F, and I think that's more of an incidental chord than anything else because it's just passing tones that link the 2 and the 5 and the 1 chord, and it's just the passing tones that create that that chord coincidentally. But afterwards we get E, G, C, and E. You could make the argument that this is a E minor 7 chord because of the notes that are happening on the harmonic rhythm. So maybe there is an argument to be made that this is a regular 4/2 resolution, but I think the big picture here is that we're getting the C and the E on the end of the beats, and this B along with this D are both creating like a tension, like a delayed resolution to what we would expect, which is our tonic triad. And afterwards we get another passing chord via the same voices. We have actually, you know what I should do is I should line this up a little bit better so that we have a clear indicator that I'm talking about the end of the beat here, where we get E, G, C, and D. Oh, sorry, I marked that already. This is just a compound beat, in the sense that I'm taking the ands of the beat and making those my analysis for really the chord that's being implied here, just narratively speaking. But if you're literally interpreting the harmony, there is a 3/7 chord here as well. We then get D, A, D, and F. That's our 2 chord, D minor. We also have B and G going on as well here, which give us a G chord in second inversion, a 5-6-4 chord, very, very briefly, but nonetheless, 5 chord is happening in between this 2 chord here and presumably this 1 chord here. E, C, G, and G. 1-6 makes sense. We also have some passing tones on the end of the beat. Doesn't give us an analyzable chord, unfortunately. It would be some type of G sus chord, but really if the chord's not intact or if the chord doesn't have all of the supporting voices there, I tend not to analyze it unless there's a compelling reason to do so. And then we get G, C, G, and E, which is just taking our tonic triad and putting it in second inversion. We then get G, B natural, F, and D, which is our 5 chord, with the 7th, G7. We use a bracket just because it's habit for me to include the bracket to show the cadential 6-4 and the 5. And then we get 2 sets of anticipation, or we get a set of 2 anticipations where we have a C and an E, which take us to a C major, C, G, E, and C, tonic triad root position. Next phrase takes us back to the original key relationships that were introduced at the beginning of the phrase, which is F and B flat sort of sharing a phrase with one another. In this case, we get an imperfect authentic cadence that I've been calling a subdominant cadence, because there really isn't terminology that refers to cadences that involve ending the phrase on the subdominant. It would make sense if if I analyzed this as a cadence that ended on the 4, but because it's being preceded by its own dominant, it technically, technically, it is a 1-to-5 progression, or sorry, a 5-to-1 progression in the key of B flat as well. But it really feels like the phrase all the way up until this point is in the key of B flat, even more so than the previous, or like the first iteration of this harmonic idea happening. But starting the phrase off, we get another C major chord, C, C, G, and E. I'm going to go ahead and reiterate the Roman numeral because it's a new line. You don't have to do that, but I do it because it feels kind of weird to leave a new system with a blank space at the front. Passing tone in the melody. And here's where it gets a bit interesting. You could say that this C is a 5 chord in the key of F major, which makes sense, but I feel like the melody here just feels undeniably C major, like E, F, G, C. So even though we get a B flat here in the bass, it just feels like we're still in the key of C major. That's just me, but this is a modulation zone for sure, and you could say that once we see B flat in the not too distant future, where we've already started the process of modulating. But I think that this is actually a secondary dominant, akin to what we saw earlier, where the modulation doesn't happen until we see the chord tonicized. So B flat, D, G, and G. I think this D is an accented non-chord tone, and really it's B flat, E, G, and G, which would be E diminished over B flat, 7-6-4 of 4, because E is the leading tone to F, and then we get A, F, A, and C, which is our 4 chord in first inversion, which then takes us to the key of F major, which is now this chord is now our tonic triad. So this is just my interpretation of the harmony. You could analyze it, like I said earlier, as soon as we see B flats, but to me the melody just feels so C major-like, and this harmony feels kind of like we're forcing the perspective of F major on it. So I feel like this is a reconciliation of both ideas. Regardless, after our 1 chord we get G, B flat, D, and D. Again, I think this D is an accented non-chord tone, and this is really 7-6. You could analyze it as 2 if you wanted to as well, but I think really this is 7-6. And then we get our tonic afterwards, F, C, A, and F, 1-6. Passing tones in the upper voices before we get F and root position, F, F, C, and A. We'll just change the figure bass, and I need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the phrase, this is turning into our 5 in the key of B flat, even though it feels like it's still our tonic at this point. We have no E flats to really indicate that B flat is part of the picture, but we end the phrase on 4, and it just sounds super interesting. This cadential pattern is one that we've seen a ton in Bach's chorale writing, and it's always interesting when we encounter it, where we have an allusion to the key without mentioning the E flat, which would tell us pretty definitively that we were in the key. It's what separates this type of cadence from this type of cadence here with the E flats present. But 5 does go to 1 in this case if you choose to analyze the end of this phrase in the key of B flat. If not, you're just analyzing this phrase as 1 going to 4. B flat, F, B flat, and D, tonic triad, root position. Next phrase takes us to the key of G minor again. We have a perfect authentic cadence at the end of the phrase, and I think we have another direct modulation here, just the F naturals versus the F sharps with the phrase separating them feels like its own distinct idea, so I'm going to analyze it as a direct modulation, but you could analyze it as a common chord. B flat is the mediant in the key of G minor. So we start off with F sharp, A, C, and E flat, which is 7, 7, F sharp fully diminished 7th, and then we get G minor, G, B flat, and D, tonic triad root position. Passing tones in the bass and the alto, which actually leave us with F, B flat, A, and D, which is kind of like a 3-4-3 chord in passing. I want to be fair to the other incidental chords that have involved other voices sort of moving off of the harmonic rhythm. And then we get E flat, C, G, and C, which is 4-6, C minor over E flat. And then we get 3 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm here with D, C, F, and B flat. Not really an analyzable chord, but we will acknowledge it anyways in the video. That's the great thing about the videos, is that I could talk through my analysis and not just write things down on the page without reasoning them. So yeah, this would be like some type of sus chord, or some type of almost like a cluster with B flat, C, and D, but instead of E flat we get F. And then we get C, C, E flat, and A, which is A diminished over C, which is 2-6. 4-6 going to 2-6 is kind of interesting. Typically chords that are a third apart will always have some type of buffer in between them. You seldom see chords that just have notes on the harmonic rhythm in general, but when you do see chords that are like this, for instance, where you have one chord here and one chord here with no non-chord tones or embellishing tones in between the two chords, you're not going to see chords that are a third apart from one another, generally speaking. You occasionally do, but the vast majority of the time there's going to be at least one buffer tone in between them, if not a fully voiced chord. So on the end of the beat we get B flat, D, D, and G, which is G minor in first inversion. We have a subdivided 2-to-1 chord progression, which is pretty interesting. 2-to-1 is a progression that we don't see a lot in Bach, especially in cases like I just described earlier, where you see it from harmonic rhythm to harmonic rhythm. But in a subdivided context here, we do see them much more frequently, and usually they're in some type of inversion. We see them even less in root position. So if it is the case, we have them in some type of inverted configuration, and it's more of just like descending the scale. And it's a subdivided chord progression, so it's not as interesting as if it were happening from harmonic rhythm to harmonic rhythm, or beat of the harmonic rhythm, that is. So afterwards we get C, C, E flat, and B. You could analyze this as a 4-7 chord, C minor 7, sorry, B flat, I said B, but I think this is a 2-6 chord, A diminished over C. Now we know that Bach loves 2-6 chords or 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. And then we see sort of the return of the 4-3 suspension here in the melody, but it's actually paired with B flat here in the tenor, which means we're getting a 1-6-4, D, B flat, D, and G, and on the end of the beat we get the 5, D, A, D, and F sharp. Just like earlier, I'm going to use that bracket to show the relationship between the two of them, and the phrase ends with G minor, G, B flat, D, and G, tonic triad, root position. Okay, next phrase, we get a half cadence in the key of D minor, but we start the phrase off in the key of F major. So I think in the key of G minor, I wrote G minor because I was talking about the G minor chord. In the key of F major, G minor is our 2 chord, and that takes us very similarly to the second phrase, where we have 4 going to 5, kind of the same thing going on. C, C, E, and G, our 5 chord. And then we get, E, C, E, and G. That's 5, 6. That takes us to our root position 5 chord, C, C, E, and C, which is, like I said, just our root position chord. And then we get our tonic triad root position, F, C, F, and A, tonic triad root position. I think we have a bit of a lower suspension going on here, where we have E as the bass, but we also have A, C, and G. Kind of an interesting chord going on here. I think it's kind of difficult to say exactly what's going on here, because I guess by virtue of the fact that this G is happening at the same time as this F, it must be some type of like 9/8 suspension going on, but it resolves down, and the bass also resolves down to E at the same time, so it's like a 9/8 suspension, but the 9th gets preserved. Maybe this is some type of tonic 7th chord in 3rd inversion, which we would expect to go to 4 in 1st inversion. Sorry, I was getting all twisted up because I'm thinking about the numbers here. It's very rare to see tonic 7th chords, but it's kind of hard to deny the fact that there isn't a tonic 7th chord here when it clearly exists. And if this is a tonic 7th chord, even though it's setting up for a suspension in the or with the melody, I guess they're working together here. F is not a well, it is a chord tone. I was about to use a double negative there and say it is not a non-chord tone. It is a chord tone, so I don't need to mark it. But instead of getting our 4 chord in 1st inversion, we get our 6 chord in root position, D, D, A, and F. So of the irregular 4/2 resolutions, irregular with the air quotes, probably chords that are in root position that are a 3rd below the chord are probably the most common substitute that we see. And I think that Bach does this here because he's preparing for the key of D minor. And even though B flat could have been a gateway to the key of D minor, he's using D minor as the pivot chord, as is often the case in this chorale, where he modulates using the tonic, whether it's the tonic turning into another chord or another chord turning into the tonic of the new key, which happens to be the case here, where D minor is now our tonic in the key of D minor. We then get B flat, C sharp, G, and E, which is C sharp fully diminished 7th over B flat, another 4/2 chord. This time it's a 7/4/2 chord, and we would expect this to go to our 3 chord in 1st inversion, but similarly to the previous 4/2 chord, we get our 5 chord in root position. That is to say that the chord roots are a 3rd apart, but the bass still resolves down by step. So it's still meeting the most common criteria that we would expect, that is the bass resolving down by step, but the roots are not always a 5th apart or a 4th apart, depending on how you think about it. In this case, we have 7 going to 5, which is displaying a similar relationship of 1 going to 6. But afterwards, we get our we get our 5 chord with a very interesting cadence here. We have another sort of suspension going on here, akin to what's going on at the end of the previous measure. We have A, C sharp, E, and B, this 9/8 suspension going on over the bass that turns into another 9/8 suspension here at the cadence. So really it's just taking the chord and turning it into a 3rd inversion 7 chord, which makes me feel like that's exactly how this is operating if the bass is echoing what's going on in the previous measure. So it's the main reason why I analyzed it this way. It's just interesting to see a tonic 7th chord. I don't know what's up with me today. I'm getting a little bit of brain fog, so apologies if some of my explanations for why I analyze things the way that I did are a little confusing. I'm trying my best. But moving on to the last phrase, I think we start the phrase off in the key of D minor and we move to the key of F not too long after. So we end with a perfect authentic cadence like we would expect, but we have a case here where instead of getting a resolution to D minor, we get a resolution to D major, and the melody still feels pretty quintessentially D minor-like with the D, C, and the B flat, but because of the F sharp in the bass and the G in the bass here, it kind of feels like we're also aligning with the idea of G minor. So we have another one of these ideas of a dominant of 4, setting up the 4 chord before we modulate to another key. We get F sharp, A, and D, which would be 5, 6 of 4, D major over F sharp, and then we get the chord in root position again, D, D, F sharp, and D with a delayed passing 7th going on here, so that's just taking the chord and putting it in root position. And then we get G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our 4 chord in the key of D minor. But instead of going to the key of G minor like we've seen earlier in the chorale, especially coming from the key of D minor, we're going to the key of F major, and G minor is now our 2 chord, with a passing 7th and a passing tone in the melody as well, which leaves us with F, D, G, and A, not really an analyzable chord. We then have E, G, C, and G, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, and then we have 4 voices moving off the harmonic rhythm. That's typically indicative of a chord being analyzable here. We have D, A, D, and F, which is our 6 chord, D minor. A bit of a deceptive subdivided progression going on here. And then we get C, B flat, E, and E. It's like an incomplete 5-7 chord there's no 5th in there. And then we get the passing 7th on the bass. E is a chord tone, G is a chord tone, and D is a non-chord tone. But if we look on the end of the beat, this leaves us with E minor 7 flat 5 over B, which is 7, 4, 3. With 5 going to 7 or with 7 going to 5, they're both the chords in the key that have dominant functions, which means that really it's less of a chord progression and more of just a prolongation of the idea that the progression is going to be resolving to the tonic at some point in the near future. So it's less of a progression and more of just an extension of an idea. And that's generally the case when you're looking at chords that are a third apart, like I talked about earlier. When we look at 4 going to 2, for instance, that's kind of prolonging the idea of like kind of a stable period, or preparing for the dominant, because the chords are so similar in terms of their pitch content. I think because the chords are sharing the majority of their pitches in common means that it's kind of like a static period, harmonically speaking. But after our intermediary 7 chord, we get A, F, A, and C, which is our tonic in first inversion. Passing tones in all the voices, which indicates that we're probably going to get another subdivided chord progression here. We have B flat, G, G, and B flat. The chord's not entirely intact, so I'm not going to mark the chord, but this is probably some type of G minor chord in first inversion. That's typically what we would expect before a 5 chord, and because we're very close to our cadence, maybe we're even in our cadence at this point, that would be a valid analysis here. But because we don't have a D in the chord, I'm not going to analyze it to be, consistent with how I've been analyzing up until this point, but you could analyze it there for sure. Anywho, we get C, A, F, and A, which is our tonic triad in second inversion. This is typically followed by 5. F is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. We get C, B flat, E, and G, which is 5, 7, C7, root position. Anticipation here in the tenor before we cadence on F major, F, A, C, and F, which is our tonic triad and root position, and it closes out our chorale in the fashion that we would expect a chorale to end in. And that's today's analysis. So as far as the takeaways for this chorale are concerned, we have a tonic 7th chord going on here, which is very interesting. We have a distant modulation, which is also very interesting, G minor to C major, which is pretty interesting. We have mid-phrase modulations abounds in this chorale. Typically speaking, when Bach starts a phrase in a particular key, like, what would be a good example of that? Here, for instance, where Bach has a direct modulation to the key of G minor, he stays in the key of G minor for the entirety of the key. But this chorale kind of breaks that convention more than we experience in this particular chorale, where Bach will modulate to a key that wasn't the same key from the previous phrase and end the phrase with an entirely different key. Other than that, there are ideas of modality, with E flat being injected at interesting points in the melody especially. We have the idea of the tonic operating as our 5 of 4. Pretty interesting here at the beginning of this phrase, after our half cadence in the key of D minor, we see a direct resolution to D major, which is functioning as the dominant of G minor, that then in turn turns into the pivot to F major. It's a pretty interesting way to go to F major, considering all of the key chords that are shared between the two keys. We also have this idea of irregular 4/2 resolutions all throughout this chorale, where the typically when we encounter a 4/2 chord, it's not resolving the way we would expect in this particular chorale. That is, we only really get one instance where a 4/2 chord resolves the way we would expect. The rest of them resolve down by step, and the roots are a third apart, which is pretty interesting. But other than that, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in this chorale. So I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video as well if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.